introduce our panelists and the lovely folks who've joined us here today for this training about planning for multiple emergencies. My name is Erica Amaya. I'm a private sector engagement specialist here at New York City Emergency Management. Sam Lawson, a community engagement specialist, is going to also be presenting today, along with Melissa Umberger, Director of Recovery and Risk, also here at NYCM. We also have an awesome guest speaker, Beth Malone, Program Manager at Neighborhood Housing Services, and she is the program manager of the Resiliency and Insurance Program. So we're really looking forward to hearing what she has to say about this topic. We've got lovely chat moderators, Mariah Washington and Amanda Kravchik of Community Engagement and Strategic Partnerships here at NYCM, and they will be monitoring the chat so that we can answer your questions at the end. Feel free to send in those questions as they occur to you, and we'll make sure to leave time at the end for that. So I just wanted to introduce our agency to those of you who might not be as familiar. New York City Emergency Management helps New Yorkers before, during, and after emergencies, and we do that through preparedness, education, and response operations. We are responsible for coordinating citywide emergency planning and a response for all types and scales of emergencies. We are an agency of more than 200 dedicated professionals, all with diverse backgrounds and areas of expertise, which we're looking forward to sharing and leveraging with you, our lovely audience today. And we work to coordinate other city agencies as well during the response and recovery. So I'll pass it over to Sam, who's going to talk to you about why we're here today.
Great. Thank you, Erica. Like Erica said, my name is Sam Lawson. I'm a community engagement coordinator, and my focus is on people with disabilities and the community-based organizations that serve them. Our objective here today, as it says on your screen, the goal of this webinar is to prepare you to create a plan that accounts for multiple emergencies that may occur at the same time or in close succession. We are holding this panel. This is the first time we've held this training, and we wanted to develop this training this year because we know that this year is different than most years in that we are all dealing with an ongoing emergency already, COVID-19. So during the pandemic, we wanted to raise awareness about the ways that emergencies, when they happen at the same time, can make it more difficult to respond to them. So we wanted to make sure that our business community and our nonprofit community and our faith-based communities are able to keep providing the services that New Yorkers rely on when another emergency happens during the pandemic, or in general when two emergencies happen at the same time. So just as some background, we wanted to start with the definitions of what we'll be talking about today. So the definition of a disaster is a widespread disruption of a community that exceeds the community's ability to cope using only its own resources. So we define disaster as something that requires resources from outside of the community to come into the community to help it be resilient. Our second thing that we wanted to talk about is cascading impacts. So we called this session Preparing for Multiple Emergencies because we wanted to make it very straightforward. In the emergency management world, you might hear the phrase cascading impacts, which just means emergencies that could happen at the same time, such as the current COVID-19 pandemic and a coastal storm or a power outage. So an example of a cascading impact is a hurricane might create a power outage, and that power outage could create a second emergency due to the power being out. So that's the idea of cascading impacts, which is when one emergency happens, it can lead to other problems that your organization could end up experiencing. And basically, this idea is that two disasters are worse than one disaster, and that is the awareness that we're trying to bring to this presentation today and why we set up this session. Next slide. So to start us off, I will be introducing our great speaker, Elizabeth Malone, who is joining us from Neighborhood Housing Services of Brooklyn. She is in the Canarsie office, and we wanted to invite Beth because she is experienced in helping people during emergencies. She's a part of the Southern Brooklyn COAD, and she interacts with both community preparedness and partners in preparedness on a regular basis. So I will kick it off to Beth, who will be speaking about how Neighborhood Housing Services of Brooklyn has been resilient in the face of many emergencies throughout her career.
Thank you, and good morning. Am I going to be visible? Okay. NHS Brooklyn is a. Are you going to stop the share, Sam?
I think we're going to leave the share up unless you wanted to share something. Yes.
No, that's okay. Okay, just to introduce NHS Brooklyn briefly, we're a HUD certified counseling agency. Excuse me, I thought I had taken care of that. A HUD certified counseling agency that's been in business since 1982. Our mission is to create and preserve affordable housing and revitalize underserved neighborhoods. With an emphasis on education and financial assistance. And we're a grassroots up organization. We're led by local residents and guided by local needs. As Sam indicated, we have an office in Canarsie, and we also have an office in the East Flatbush neighborhood. We serve virtually all of Brooklyn. I'm sorry, I thought I had taken that thing down. One moment, please. One of the reasons that we are able to respond to multiple emergencies is because of our experience with multiple emergencies. I've been with the NHS since 1982, since 2000. And of course, the first emergency that we hit was 9/11. At that point in time, I was the insurance program manager for property insurance, because we have, property insurance is a crucial part of home ownership, which was our major focus at the time. And then when 9/11 hit, we really expanded my footprint because we needed to make sure that our communities were able to respond to disasters. At the time of 9/11, our footprint really didn't include any kind of emergency management or emergency response, but insurance usually provides about 80% of the recovery funds in a typical emergency, though, of course, there's no such thing as a typical emergency. So the emergency response and disaster and recovery issues landed in my footprint. And I, at that point, started to engage our organization in these issues, primarily by networking with other organizations that have been addressing them. At the time, NHS was had multiple multiple partners, all networked together under the NHS New York City, and that is the official area that I worked in. But of course, I was interfacing with NHS of East Flatbush as one of our 8 partners. What that led us into is partnering with the organizations that address these disasters. I've been a longtime partner of New York City Emergency Management when it was called OEM, and working with them on bringing recovery and disaster preparation out to the residents in all of the boroughs. I also became a member of the Regional Catastrophic Planning Team for New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. The worst acronym ever. It went on for 2 lines. And also NIDIS, which was created after 9/11 to help distribute funding for the individuals that needed to recover, and VOAD, the voluntary New York City VOAD, the voluntary agencies active in disaster, organizations like the Red Cross. So being in touch with all of these and bringing the information on what was going on to my organization, we really became sensitive to what might happen. Then in 2007, when we had the financial crisis, because of my work in disaster, I recognize this as like a financial tsunami, a little slow moving. But one of the major things that occurred that I brought into the organization because of our involvement with disaster preparation was the trauma and stress concepts, which are vitally important to understand if you're going to function through a disaster or multiple disasters. The trauma and stress, both for our customers and the reflected trauma for our staff. I noticed this when one of my colleagues said that she had given her cell phone number to a client and was getting calls at like 3 o'clock in the morning. That is a real indicator of reflected trauma. And that is something that we built in to our organization as a emergency and disaster management tool, though we just called it, stress and managing staff stress. There was a module added to our national program, our national partners who do foreclosure prevention training on the, I'm sorry, I don't seem to know how to get this to stop, on the, on managing staff stress. And this is really vitally important to keep functioning and to understand how you function under a crisis, because it affects efficiency, it affects the ability to be nimble. It's a vitally important concept to managing disasters as an organization, because the staff is the one that's mostly affected by it. Now, of course, when Sandy hit, that was a huge wake-up call for everybody. And I cannot tell you how many people said to me, "You told us this would happen." I was going to get a t-shirt that said, "Yes, I told you this would happen." But again, it was a big wake-up call for many organizations. We did not have the Canarsie office up and running at that time. We were serving that neighborhood via our East Flatbush office. But when we got down there on the ground, one of the first things we did was assess the needs of the people that we serve, our client needs, and start to bring in resources to address that. So that's how and we created a stakeholders network so that we could bring in other organizations, and we maintain those relationships to this day. Because we had organizational buy-in, we had the support of the board of directors, our board of directors, which is composed primarily of residents, and putting disaster preparation and emergency preparation and response into our mission was an easy reach, because we had laid the groundwork by making this part of our thinking through, like I said, the 9/11 and the financial collapse. Now, we did open the Canarsie office, which gave us, for the first time, a second location, because we were no longer a part of that larger network that had existed under the NHS NYC title. So that made us actually appreciate the networking of technology, because we had to upgrade our technology so that we were able to network our data across different locations. And also, we ended up, we really came to appreciate the redundancy in roles, that we had staff that was cross-trained, staff that that were flexible in terms of where they could work, where physically work from, and covering the um, covering the different needs as they cried up. But I think the organizational buy-in was really key. My executive director is a member of CERT, so we really had the backing. And again, the consciousness of what happened, that we needed to be able to respond, really hit home on that one. Now, when the pandemic hit, COVID hit, we already had established networks for solid information. We're partnering with the emergency management, the Department of Health, and again, our different disaster organizations like CERT and VOAD, and then the new creations of the COADs. We were a very early adapter for safe practices, due to the fact that I was able, when I presented the issues to our staff meetings and our board, they were like, yeah, we get it. The groundwork had already been laid. I didn't have to start explaining what a disaster was. So we were very early. We did the safe practices before they were even put out by the city. And what really made us able to function and improve during this pandemic is the nimbleness that we had, nimble technology and a nimble staff. We were able to, we already had the groundwork laid in technology to transfer to work at home, including access to our server, our main server, which is located off-site. And so any of the staff members were able, this technology went up within a day or two. It was simply a matter of turning on the button. We also networked our phone system so that if you call me, and unfortunately that's the phone that keeps ringing, it's through my office phone. All right, not through my personal phone. So our phone numbers are held in are not shared with the public that we serve. And of course, we migrated to Zoom for a huge number of webinars, and putting all of the programs that we used to present in person onto an internet platform, a webinar platform, including using PowerPoints and other, the technology available for that. What really helped out too is that our nimble staff, in terms of the adapting to the technology needs and to the change in the format of our business presentations, our social media maven became a Zoom master, working with our technology. And oops, excuse me, I need to redo that. I'm almost at my limit. Okay. And I'm a technology master today, you can tell. So and working as a team on making the migration of our programs. All of our programs, with the exception of home maintenance training, have migrated to the web. And this has been at least 2 months that we've been able to do this. Again, because we had the tech in place and we had the mindset in place, and we worked, of course, as a team. Also, and a number of our staff have also shifted to fill needs that increased as opposed to their usual practices. And then one of the important things that happened too is that our usual funders and our resource access to resources, because we were known as an organization that had expertise in disaster and emergency recovery, we were known for our critical competencies here. So it was an easy reach for them to help us to grant our request for the additional resources for things like more technology. We needed more laptops. We needed some cell phones. to bring all the staff up to the appropriate level of technology, and also the belief in our funders that we can deliver the programs that we have been delivering, so that there has not been any crucial interruption in service. Though I do miss the home maintenance training program. So the challenges, okay, are that you can standardize a process, but people aren't standardized, and there has been staff learning curves. There are days when I say, I cannot do another learning curve. And, everybody feels that way at some point. So that has to be taken into consideration. Also, the consideration of the stress that people are under and how it affects their productivity. You simply cannot expect people to be as productive under these very difficult circumstances until things settle down and they feel more comfortable in their roles. So expectations of staff and staff management become very crucial when you are changing process so greatly. We do have a way of reporting in when we do work at home by monitoring our activity. That's another challenge that can happen. And also one of the big challenges for us is that we have a high document process for things like foreclosure prevention and home buying. And some of our partners in this were wedded to old technology. For example, many of the lenders required us to fax in paperwork. And, they've had to make some adaptations to this. Electronic signatures. We're dealing with very confidential financial information from our customers. We're dealing with mortgages and purchases, and so we have confidentiality requirements that are very strict. And mutating those to address the new issues has been one of the challenges. And that's one of the things that I think need to be thought through is your relationship with the customer. What are your requirements for them? Can those be adapted to the new process? And with the other partners that you're working with, are they up on their technology? Again, we're having difficulty with some of the documentation that's required due to having to fax, and we can't be in offices. So the last thing I need to say is that we have to get to, you have to be aware of the constant program changes, all right? Absolutely every day is a new day, and that kind of flexibility needs to be baked in, okay?
Thank you so much, Beth, for that amazing presentation on what NHS Brooklyn is doing. Some best practices that you mentioned that I just wanted to highlight before we move on were connectedness, so connecting to the government and to other organizations, your use of technology, so this is something that we can all think more about, redundancy of roles and the importance of staff, and documentation and making sure privacy is still included in your practices. And finally, funding. Beth mentioned a lot of best practices for grants and funding, which we go in depth on in other trainings, but I think that's something everyone should know. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Erica.
Thanks, Sam, and thank you so much, Beth, for that really enlightening experience, or sharing your experiences. So we have a question for the attendees. Even though it looks like you might be all alone in this presentation, there are many of you here, and we would love to kind of get a readout of what is one challenge that your organization has faced. It could be since the beginning of the pandemic, or maybe something that has happened since the latest reopening phase. We would love to hear what you have to say. I'll give you about 10 seconds to type in your answer, and then maybe one of our moderators, Mariah, or maybe even Sam, if you can read some of those chat responses, and we can kind of see what the folks in the room have been dealing with. I think to lightly touch on one thing that Beth mentioned is that expectations management is really important when you're working remotely, or when you're maybe even working double time in person. If you're an essential service and maybe you're at a food pantry and you're experiencing an increase in your client traffic, being able to set those expectations, start from a place of grace, and let your staff, your volunteers know that we're all in this together, and that we all need to rely on each other in order to accomplish the task at hand, I think is really something that we here at NYCM have especially experienced. Do we have any comments, Sam?
I'm not seeing any yet. Please write one challenge in the chat if you can, and we'll read a few before we move on. So as an organization with nationwide locations, we have been impacted by COVID. All of the natural disasters and the recent SCOTUS vacancy and impact on access to healthcare. So if you're a national organization, then national emergencies in politics can definitely be a cascading impact. So the second one, as a faith-based organizations, church leaders, and this is something we've heard a lot across the city, are grappling with not having services in their congregations and having to be able to adapt in new ways. Jason says, we have to operationalize our business continuity plans that have never seen an actual activation prior to the pandemic. That's a really great point. And Jennifer says we have to move our company fully remote. And when there is a power outages or internet disruptions, for example, our staff in California and Seattle, because of the wildfires, are experiencing this, we have to support them. And our final one is our trainees are limited in availability and access to technology and devices in continuing education, which is something we've also heard a lot, especially with New York City school students, is access to the internet and technology.
Oh, there's so many good points that have been brought up. It sounds like we have organizations that have locations across the country, and while our conversation today is mostly focused on New York City and the 5 boroughs, I think that these concepts can be applied regardless of your location, as long as you have a place to start and follow our steps. This will definitely be applicable across the board. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. So I want to, using the last question as a springboard, I want all of you to do a kind of 10-second evaluation of your current plans. One of our respondents mentioned that their business continuity plan had never been put into practice, and this is the first time that it's been used. So I think that now, 6 months into this pandemic, you have the perfect opportunity to set the place setting for where you stand, so that you can see how far you need to go. So how well did your organization's emergency plan work? Did you kind of ease into it? Were you learning along the way? Did it take some time to implement, and you're still in the process of figuring out what's best for yourself or for your employees or your volunteers? And then what changes are you going to make to your plan if another emergency happens? I know that this can be really stressful, so I definitely want to encourage everyone to take a deep breath and really take your time with this process. It doesn't need to be done overnight or in a day. The whole reason that we're encouraging this awareness is so that you have time to put a plan in place before you actually need it. Doing those actions in response when you don't have a plan can feel really haphazard. And as Beth mentioned, when you're stressed out, your capacity to do simple tasks is really minimized. And so taking the time now, even though it's a really stressful environment, but when you have some breathing room, is really going to be the best place for you to start. So I want to, so you've had a few seconds to think about your own response to the plan, whether you personally thought it was good, bad, or otherwise. What other kinds of feedback did you get from your leadership, from your staff, from your clients? All good, bad, otherwise, it's all information for you to make changes targeted towards success, right? So how are you going to incorporate that feedback into your revised plan? There are a couple of different ways that you can take this information in, depending on how large your organization is. It could be a quick qualitative, you know, 5-minute conversation with a few of your key staff who've maybe you know, had conversations with their own teams. You could do a more formalized survey via a tool like SurveyMonkey or Google Forms to try and gather information and assess how your staff feel. Do they feel prepared for another type of emergency, or have they shared with you that they're very concerned? All of this stuff is really good information to gather so that you can make sure that you're starting from a solid foundation in a good place. Another thing, another best practice that that we believe here at NYCM is that you should be reevaluating your plans, your emergency action plans annually or whenever circumstances warrant. And with the pandemic, I believe that circumstances warranted multiple times because the situation was changing. So if there is to be further phase reopenings or steps backwards, that's a really good key indicator that it's time to review your plan. When the seasons change, I think if you don't already have a plan in place for a coastal storm or a power outage, regardless of what it's caused by, a snowstorm or a hurricane, or just good old-fashioned Con Ed being Con Ed, then you definitely want to take the time to do that, whether it's because of phase restrictions or weather forecasts or the season changing. And once you've done that work on the front end, you can just revise your plan when necessary, and chances are you probably won't need to change things if you've been revising your plans on a regular basis or when circumstances warrant, as I mentioned. So one other thing that I want to bring up is our emergency action plans are all operations that are under our control, right? We can help our employees, we can aid our clients, we can serve our volunteers, but we can't necessarily control those outside things that are around us. And I think that the pandemic really highlighted a lot of what those things are that are outside of our control. We saw supply chain interruptions, we saw restrictive movement, we saw forced closures. And those considerations are really important to think about. So be creative. You don't necessarily need to think about all of the different things that could happen. Just think about what has happened and what might be likely to happen in the near term. And if you're having trouble with some of those forecasts, that's what our agency is here to help you with. We're also always pushing out information that's aimed to help you further refine your planning efforts. So I kind of talked about those key steps that we want you to follow. It's pretty straightforward, although these steps definitely have some meat to those bones. So I don't want to mislead you. And this is definitely going to take some time, which is why you want to create some space, some breathing room around this operation. So the first thing that we just talked about was evaluating your plans. You can do that with a simple tabletop conversation with your leadership. You can do it with your own internal team. Be creative with this. You really want to, make sure that your plan is set up for success. So we already talked about that evaluation process. We want you to reassess those hazards. And by hazards, we mean anything that could threaten the operation of your mission or your business function. So what has changed? I mentioned those those phase restrictions. I mentioned that hurricane season is upon us, or coastal storm season. It is fall as of 2 days ago, and winter is coming. So make sure that you're prioritizing making changes for the threat or the hazard that is most likely to occur. And one other thing I want to mention, we've been talking a lot about environmental threats and hazards, but cybersecurity is definitely something that's on all of our minds, especially with how much we have been relying on technology while we're all working remote and doing remote trainings. So cybersecurity is another up and coming topic that we'll definitely be sure to keep you all apprised about. And then that third step, once you've reassessed those hazards and have prioritized making those changes, again, this is not done in a vacuum. This is done with the input of your leadership and your team and the reality that your organization is facing. You're going to make those changes to your plan. And we're going to talk about some resources in a couple of other slides coming up to help you in making those revisions. But you want to take into account those special considerations that are unique to just what you and your organization does. And then you're going to communicate those changes. Beth mentioned that as good as your plan might be on paper, it's only as good as the people that are enacting it and performing those steps and processes. So you're going to want to make sure your staff not only know that there's a change to that plan, but maybe that they've practiced it to the extent that you're able, that they've read it, that they're familiar with it, and that they can access it during the proper time. Changing that document, updating that Word document is the first step. Training and awareness will allow your adjustments to be successful in the operation. So some special considerations that I think that apply to this group in particular are to tailor your plan to your mission critical needs. We call in business continuity, it's your critical functions or your critical operations. You're going to, I think we all understand, right, that one size does not fit all. So what might work for somebody else might not work for you. You're going to want to think about the technology that's needed. I think at this point, most of us are pretty much set up in our remote work options, but are your needs changing? Do you need to deploy backup battery power packs for your staff who might be fielding calls from their homes in the event of, we underwent some power outage during tropical storm Isaias at the beginning or back in August, and some members from the NYCM staff were actually out of power, and we've now kind of readjusted how we're going to support those folks at home. So that's just one example. Keeping up to date with new guidelines, you're going to want to make sure that you are subscribed to all of those Notify NYC outlets, the CDC, the New York State press releases that come out from the governor, especially during this time with pandemic, with the COVID-19 pandemic. It's just so new. We don't necessarily know what's coming around the bend. So make sure that you have a steady drip of information from official sources like us here at NYCM. And then if your clients or your staff are going to need accessibility accommodations. If your supply chain is fragile and you might need to seek out alternative vendors or have backup contracts with those folks. So just make sure that you're considering those special needs for your organization. And I'm going to turn it over to Sam to talk about an emergency needs assessment.
Thank you, Erica. So again, I know we got a question in the chat about what if our organization doesn't have an emergency plan, or this is something you might want to incorporate into your existing plan. This is a page from our community preparedness toolkit. So our toolkit for talking about how can you connect with other organizations in your community. And one of the best practices that we recommend is when an emergency happens, is that you conduct a needs assessment. So a needs assessment is where your organization or your staff, or maybe you're part of a network of other organizations, you ask yourselves, what are the things that we are noticing in our community are the most needed? In our toolkit, which we will put a link for in the chat, we lay out some of the very common ones that we see during an emergency. So you might see that in your organization, the people you serve are in need of food or water or shelter, certain items, medical care, waste disposal, spiritual care, which we heard a lot about from Beth. That is one that comes up all the time, especially for you faith-based organizations, and transportation. So this is important because this will give you an idea of where to focus your efforts when there are cascading impacts, multiple disasters happening at the same time. It can be very chaotic and hard to figure out where to best put your resources. So one thing we recommend in a plan is to start by evaluating what the needs are. So you can do this by, we recommend putting out a survey or maybe calling people and asking them what are the needs that you are seeing on the ground, or what is the situation that you're observing. This is a good place to start after an emergency happens so that you can begin to address the needs of the community. And this is a training that we're happy to help you. This is something we're happy to help you learn how to do. Next slide, Erica. So again, some resources that we wanted to share with you were our community preparedness toolkit. That's what I just mentioned. So this will take you through how do you as a community prepare for an emergency. This concept might be newer for some of our business partners that are on the call today. But the idea is that if you are connected to other organizations, then you will be stronger than just going it alone. We heard Beth talk a lot about how after September 11th, a lot of organizations started to connect with each other to distribute funding, to help people, and to make sure that the community could come back stronger. That is a best practice and something that we want to encourage. Organizations that are connected respond more quickly and recover more quickly from an emergency. So we're happy to help you learn how to connect with other organizations and make a plan together. The second one is the Small Business Services. That's what SBS stands for, Business Continuity Toolkit, which is also in the chat, which can basically bring you through the steps, some basic steps of how to make a plan. So for the person who's asking, our organization doesn't have a plan yet. That is something that can guide you through what should you start including, and that can be that first step. We do offer a training. Community Preparedness offers a training about if your organization doesn't have staff or money to create a plan, how you can do it without breaking the bank, essentially. So, and I'm sure Partners in Preparedness would also love to connect with you to help you make a plan. So we recommend you don't have to go it alone. We are here to support you. The Department of Health and Mental Hygiene of New York City put out a pandemic planning guide. So they developed this before COVID-19, and now it is very relevant. So this will talk about some special considerations for responding to a pandemic. That is another resource we would love to offer you. And finally, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has put out this year a COVID-19 pandemic operational guidance for the 2020 hurricane season. I think we all know if a hurricane were to strike New York City during COVID-19, it would be even more devastating than it would normally. We are very vulnerable to coastal storms. So that is something that can help you plan for both at the same time. We also heard that some of you have national organizations, so this could be a tool for you in the months ahead, as we still have about 2 months of the active Atlantic hurricane season left. And with that,
Thanks, Sam. So the next thing we wanted to do, we've got about 13 minutes left on our scheduled time, although the rest of us, I think minus Beth, are going to be available for just a few more minutes to answer your questions. So that, oh, I just want to make sure my screen's still sharing. Great. So we want to ask you, the audience, what will you do? This is actually a slide from our tabletop toolkit. If you're a partner in Preparedness, or if you're interested in that program, we can drop that link into the chat. You have access to this. A tabletop is a conversational exercise of a plan that already exists. And so in this scenario, we're asking you, the audience, what would you do in this situation? So I'll go ahead and read the slide, but think a little bit about what you would do, and please submit your thoughts into the chat, and we'll share a little bit. The COVID-19 pandemic continues, and Consolidated Edison, or Con Ed, confirms that they are currently experiencing a massive grid outage, primarily affecting, we'll just take out the west side of Manhattan and say your area, so we can make sure your organization is impacted in this scenario. And the cause of power failure is unknown at the time and remains to be under investigation. So what are you going to do? And here are some considerations that you might want to take into account. How does this power outage impact any operational changes you've made for COVID-19, including those employees working from home potentially? Does the organization rely on backup power, or do you have backup power, especially for some of your technology needs, like your server room, if you're a big enough organization? And then how long can the organization be without power before critical functions are affected? Or maybe how long can your organization's leadership be without power? And what is your backup plan for those who might not have access? And with interrupted phone line service, what are, if any, concerns regarding communication capabilities? I know a lot of us are digital for the most part with our cell phones, but cell phones only have a battery life of so long, especially in the cold. It gets drained a little bit sooner. So I'll give a minute or two for the discussion to get populated, and then we'll see if we have any comments. We seeing anything yet, Sam?
No, not yet, but I just wanted to reiterate, if you have an answer to any of these questions, please put it in the chat. Basically, how do you think that this scenario would affect your organizations? I think we'll wait just for a few examples to be in the chat in respect to time.
Thanks, Sam. And as I mentioned, this is just a little sample of our tabletop toolkit that our partners in Preparedness have access to. In the toolkit, we actually created an organizer's guide, so anyone can organize and host a tabletop conversation with their leadership or with their teams. And we have a couple of different sample scenarios. Last year, we put out a coastal storm response tabletop. We followed that up with just releasing a coastal storm recovery tabletop guide this past summer. We also have this power outage example, and we also have a steam pipe rupture, which is something that we've definitely seen in the history of New York City, especially in the spring and fall. So I'll pause now and see if there are any other comments. Sorry, I can't see that comment screen, Sam.
I'm not seeing any comments, so I think it might be best, in the interest of time, to move on to our next item. And then if anyone does write in the chat, we can mention it during the Q&A.
I think that's a great plan. Super. Okay, so with all of our conversations about assessing your hazards and prioritizing your risks, it is my pleasure to introduce Melissa Umberger, Director of Recovery and Risk. We want to introduce this tool that will help you understand the hazards and reduce the impact overall.
Great.
Thanks for joining us, Melissa.
Yeah, no problem. And thank you, Erica. Thank you, Sam and Mariah, for letting me have a couple of minutes here to talk about a new tool that the Risk Reduction and Recovery Bureau has just created. Can everyone see my screen? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you and see your screen.
Excellent. Okay, great. So some of you guys may be familiar with our hazard mitigation plan, but those that aren't, this is a plan that we're required to do every 5 years in order to be eligible for post-disaster funding from FEMA. So last year we moved to a completely web-based plan. This is the website here, nychazardmitigation.com. We received a lot of great feedback from community organizations that are part of this community preparedness network, and we listened to that feedback. And the biggest feedback was, it's great that you're giving us this information about the hazards that affect New York City, but how do I know what affects me and my neighborhood? And so this tool, the Community Risk Assessment Dashboard, attempts to answer those questions. And so, you know, the real purpose here is to help your organizations do some of the things that Erica and Sam had mentioned. When you're looking through the Community Preparedness Toolkit, you're making your plans. We hope that this tool can help you do that step of reassessing your hazards. So the way it works is it's very interactive. You can either select a neighborhood, which are aligned by community districts, or you could type in an address. But since we're kind of short on time, I'm just going to pick a community district. So I will pick Brooklyn, Brighton Beach, Coney Island. And what happens is when you select a neighborhood, the map will zoom into the community district that you selected. At the top, you'll see the hazards that affect this community district. And for each hazard, we have additional information that assesses risk. So here we have our evacuation zones. You can see the zone coverage for this community district, and you can see how that compares to the New York City average. At the bottom, we have suggested hazard mitigation actions that could be implemented. Some come from community organizations as sort of case studies. And so I'll go through another. So the thing that's kind of neat about this is when you click on the hazards, you get more information. So you can see how Sandy impacted the city in this community district, historic coastal storm tracks. One thing I'm going to select here is financial assistance. So you can look at from past coastal storms that have happened in this district, the amount of FEMA funding that was provided, looking at public assistance, which is given to public agencies and some nonprofits. And then we also have individual assistance. And so this is assistance that's given to individuals to help recover. So this sort of gives you a snapshot of how much this community district has been given, and then you get further breakdowns by the different funding types. I'll switch to flooding real quick. Another thing that's interesting is that we look at demographics as sort of amplifying the risk of the hazards that could happen. So we have age demographics, you know, looking at which populations may be more vulnerable. So this, it gives you a breakdown looking at both younger populations and also older populations. What is that demographic breakdown for this community district? I will say we have respiratory viruses. This was created prior to COVID, and so we hope to enhance this tool. So this was a study that the Department of Health did, a pandemic influenza vulnerability index. As I said, this is pre-COVID. So this is looking at your traditional flu, in which areas may be more vulnerable. Obviously, as we get more information on vulnerability for COVID, we plan to enhance this tool in partnership with DOHMH. And then the last one I'll show is coastal erosion. This only appears for a selected few community districts that have historically had issues with coastal erosion. And it's a little bit different from the other hazards in that we have this story map. And when you scroll down, you get aerial imagery of areas, as I mentioned, Staten Island, Coney Island, and the Rockaways. And it's really interesting because we have a toggle feature where you can look at what the coastline looked like in 1924 as opposed to how it looked in 2018. And so we had looked at Coney Island, that was a neighborhood we looked at. And so one thing that is interesting, if you look at the Seagate neighborhood in the 1990s, the Army Corps had constructed a groin, which you see here, and that had actually inadvertently caused erosion in the Seagate area, which was further amplified by Hurricane Sandy. And then the 2018 imagery is showing how the Army Corps had replenished this area. And then here on the right-hand side is an example of a stewardship program that the Rockaway Waterfront Alliance had put into place. So, where we can, we are trying to include not just identifying the risk, but what are some things community organizations can do at the local level to reduce the impacts of these hazards. And I know I'm way over time, but I just want to point out that, this is our pilot phase. We plan to enhance this, revise it, add more hazards over time, but we strongly encourage everyone to give us feedback. We want to hear from you. So we have a feedback form here. If you click on it, you're able to provide feedback on the tool. If your community organization is doing a mitigation project, we'd love to hear and be able to spotlight the work that you guys are doing in your neighborhoods. And I will stop there. Thank you.
What a whirlwind tour. Thank you so much, Melissa. It looks like a really fabulous tool. And we'll definitely include this link in our follow-up email, along with some of the other references and resources that we've mentioned. All right. So if I can have control back over the screen.
I'm stopping.
Oh, thanks, Melissa.
Yep, no problem.
I'm now the presenter. Fabulous. Okay. All right. So, no. We have a couple. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sam.
We just wanted to mention a few things that we can do to keep engaging with you quickly. This is the end of our presentation. So up next week, we will be hosting Community Preparedness. We'll be hosting a training on how to serve people with disabilities during an emergency. If you're an organization that doesn't always serve the disability community, how can you do that effectively and respectfully? And strategic partnerships will be hosting a Partners in Preparedness Coastal Storm Recovery tabletop, and October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which is even more important this year because we are all relying on technology. And with that, I think please feel free to connect with us, and we will take questions that are currently in the chat.